The Dan Yorke State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
Good evening and welcome to My State of Mind. I am Dan Yorke. If you've been paying attention to hospital news lately, you know that the Attorney General, Peter Neronha, got in the middle and rewrote a finance deal between Fatima Hospital, Roger Williams Hospital, and its parent company. It is a major league step in on a regulatory level and one which may have saved this state a lot of grief. Ted Nesi gives us some background, and then we'll talk to the general about the complications and details and meaning of this crisis, perhaps averted.
This dispute has been getting national attention because Rhode Island is one of the only states where the Attorney General has a major say over hospital ownership changes, giving the smallest state some big leverage in this case. Back in April, California-based Prospect Medical Holdings threatened to shut down Roger Williams and Fatima hospitals rather than comply with the conditions Attorney General Peter Neronha wanted to put on a potential ownership change. But today, the two sides announced a deal, and Neronha expressed no regrets about taking a tough line against the private equity firm that controls Prospect, Leonard Green.
Leonard Green wanted out, and the question was under what conditions.
Among those conditions, Prospect must put $80 million in escrow for the two hospitals. Prospect can no longer charge the Rhode Island facilities millions in management fees, and Prospect must appoint some local board members.
The track record here isn't great. We need to make sure that those commitments are backed by financial security.
In a statement, Prospect largely ignored Neronha's criticisms, saying it remains committed to, quote, high-quality health care. Originally, the Attorney General had demanded $120 million from Prospect, much more than the $80 million in the final agreement.
At that point in my discussions with Prospect, they were not cooperating with me. If you want to talk to me about a resolution, I need to understand your numbers. You need to share information with me. You need to be candid with me. Don't tell me it's all rosy and fine when I know that it isn't. And so when I come up with a number under those circumstances, I'm going to err to my good and their bad.
Rhode Island Senate President Dominic Ruggiero, whose district includes Fatima Hospital, was among those who thanked Neronha today for taking this tough stance against Prospect. Ruggiero saying, quote, the Attorney General's thorough scrutiny was absolutely necessary. Ted Nesi, 12 News.
And so our top law enforcement officer joins us once again. You know, I said early on in the beginning of his interest in running for office that I was bullish on his run for office, and I knew that he would keep a commitment to stay accessible, even though sometimes the conversations aren't easy. He always is. Tonight, I think, is going to be easy. General, welcome in. Easy because I think you saw a problem. It seems that there's a consensus, and I can't see any holes in it, that you solved the problem. And it leads us to, I think, a conversation about where we go in the future with finance of hospitalization and medical service to the community. But we'll get to that a little bit later on. Thank you for joining me. Appreciate it.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Dan.
Once upon a time, you know, there was a big investment company that is doing very much what many investment companies have done. They buy companies, they set them up for whatever, you know, pro forma they can provide. Then they borrow a lot of money against what the debt service allows them to do. They cash in on that money. From there, who knows? And it seems to be the theme of corporate America. Am I getting kind of the, you know, financing for dummies concept about what we're talking about with this hospital refinance / ownership adjustment?
Yeah, I think you are, Dan. I think you're driving to the heart of it. I mean, I think there are two big concepts to keep in mind. Number one is healthcare, like every other business. And I would argue that it shouldn't be, because obviously you're dealing with the health and safety of people. So there's that. But there are two ways, I think, to make money, and we'll get into the details, I'm sure. But in this particular instance, there was a private equity firm, had the majority stake in Prospect Medical Holdings, which owns our Rhode Island hospitals, along with 15 others. There's two ways for them to make money: run a really good healthcare organization, generate profits, pocket those profits. And then there's another way, which is what happened here, which is take out a big loan, pocket those loan proceeds, run up the debt on the company, put the company in a much worse financial position so they can't support our Rhode Island hospitals. When that happens, it's time for a regulator to step in, at least this one, And that's what we did here. We wanted to make sure that notwithstanding what that private equity company did, along with the other two owners, that notwithstanding what they've done to weaken the national company, which in turn weakens the local hospitals because they have to support our local hospitals. Notwithstanding that, we were going to have cash in hand to make sure that going forward, our hospitals would be secure. And that's what we try to do here.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about what actually happened. So this Prospect company has 17 hospitals across the country. The two that are dangling in actually this full transaction that they wanted to make were the Rhode Island hospitals, not the Rhode Island hospital, but the hospitals they own in Rhode Island, Fatima and Roger Williams in Providence, Fatima in North Providence. You got in the way a little bit here, right? Because the hospitals in other states, their transactions more or less went through. In Rhode Island, you stepped up and said, hey, wait a second. First of all, before we talk about what you saw, what the alarm was, and what was the cause to react, explain the nature, if you can, of what the corporation was and what the corporation holding the hospitals will be now. It really is that the private equity wanted out and the existing partners, minority partners, remained in, correct?
That's right. So Leonard Green Equity Partners, which is a private equity firm, they are not that many people. If you go to their website, they have a website. They have like, I don't know, 30, 40 people who work there, partners. And what they do is they generate money to invest, and then they try to make money. And there are two ways: run a great business or take out a loan, pocket the loan proceeds. That's what they do. They own 60%. There were two wealthy individuals who owned the other 40%. One's a doctor, Sam Lee. The other one is David Topper. Mr. Lee and Mr. Topper want to buy. Leonard Green wants to sell Leonard Green's 60% interest. So now Lee and Topper own 100% of the entity. That's what the transaction as proposed was, and what we were being asked to approve, and the Department of Health and the Health Services Council were being asked to approve.
And the money, and I appreciate you handling this in a simple way so everybody can understand it, because this gets complicated. They may have pocketed some near $500 million when they borrowed money and took out the the financial guts, more or less, of the foundation of the company. But this private equity firm knows when to hold them and fold them. They were simply looking for $10 million to get out. Caveat being, no longer responsible for what had been built up, and that is $1 billion worth of liabilities, meaning debt, correct?
That's right. So the purchase price, so think about that for a minute. The purchase price initially was $12 million for 17 hospitals around the country, and some ancillary businesses too, but let's just keep it at the 17 hospitals. $12 million. We bought the building, my predecessor bought the building next door to this office for $6 million. So think about that for a minute. We bought the building next door, 180 South Main Street, for $6 million. This company was selling 17 hospitals for $12 million. That was a huge red flag. That was a huge red flag to me. One of them. There are others, but that was one of them.
All right. And so obviously it comes to your attention because in addition to, busting criminals and other civil duties, the Attorney General has a charge here when it comes to the hospital medical community. Explain the charge and explain how this came to your attention.
Yeah, look, so we are under Rhode Island law, what's called a regulator. So we have to regulate under the Hospital Conversions Act anytime there's a significant change in ownership or a merger of hospitals. Department of Health is one regulator, we're the other. We both have to sign off on it. The Health Services Council, we've heard about that in the news lately. They advise the Department of Health. So the Department of Health and the Health Services Council are one regulator, we're the other. There's a whole series of criteria we have to look at, but there are two ones that were really in play here. Number one is we have to ensure that the new hospital will deliver affordable, accessible, quality healthcare to the people of the state. That's kind of the overarching principle. One of the specific criteria is this, that we have to make sure that there is a minimum financial investment in the hospitals to make sure that they will operate in a high-performing way. And so that's our charge, is to make sure that these hospitals will be a going concern going forward. And it was because of that criteria that I felt I needed to take the action that we did.
All right, perfect. When we come back, will describe what the actual action is and what Attorney General Peter Neronha has required on this transaction. Stay with us on My State of Mind. Attorney General Peter Neronha, we're discussing his move in on this transaction for the Fatima and Roger Williams hospitals that got a lot of attention. Actually, the general drew a lot of attention when he raised the flag on this, and he's explained in the last segment, how it came to his attention. I mean, you put out a very, very tough press release before you got to the business of reformatting, for lack of a better term, this transaction to your regulatory satisfaction. In fact, you were in the courts, and the judges were involved, or Judge Stern was involved, as I recall, and everybody kind of bought some time to make this thing happen, correct?
Yeah, look, we were ready to issue our decision on whatever Friday that was, I think at the end of April. As is the court, the customary practice, we will give the parties our decision so they'll have an opportunity. If there are things in there that are confidential, at least initially, or we haven't resolved those things yet, it's really as much of a courtesy as anything else. Well, our decision then, like the decision we issued a couple of days ago, is pretty hard hitting. It lays the facts out, which I think the people of Rhode Island are entitled to. They didn't like it, so they withdrew their application. I felt like at that point that my decision, a final decision, was a public record and the public had a right to see it. They disagreed. And that issue before Judge Stern was just whether we could release that decision or not. I still maintain that initial decision's a public record, but set that aside. They withdrew their application. They then reached out. They wanted an opportunity to come in and speak to me about why the number that I had in mind at that point, which was $120 million at that point, was a number that was unnecessary. It didn't need to be that high. So I gave them that opportunity, but I was not going to change my position until I was comfortable that we had the money in hand that we needed. And that's how we ultimately ended up where we ended up.
Okay. Thank you for filling in that gap. So you did have personal discussions with these partners, correct?
Yeah, look, I mean, I've had direct contact myself going back to December. And over time, and of course my team was working it, but I had direct contact with them. And, from December through, I would say early April, I personally continued to get more information, read more, frankly, study more, focus more, as this was coming to a head. And I reached a conclusion in early April that they were going to need to take some significant steps for me to approve this because I needed those hospitals to be secure. And I didn't feel like we could rely on mere promises alone.
Okay. So look, what is the hospital's net worth? That had to have been established, the two hospitals' net worth. Were you able to carve out what the Rhode Island assets were worth?
Yeah, Dan, we didn't really feel like we had to do that. Let me explain why. There were two principles that we knew were driving what we were going to do, and they're these two very basic principles. The first principle, or first fact is that our Rhode Island hospitals, Fatima and Roger Williams, can't survive without support from the national company. They run a loss on their operating expenses every year, and they cannot make the necessary capital improvements every year. They just can't, and they have never been able to do that. So they are entirely dependent on the national company to pay cover their operating losses and make the necessary capital expenditures every year. What's a capital expenditure? For your listeners, it's renovating an emergency room, it's renovating hospital beds, new equipment, buying a practice to feed the hospital, if you will, physician practices, the things that hospitals need to invest in every year to maintain their level of quality. So that was principle number one. The local hospitals need the national company. And that's where the problem arose. The national company today is nowhere near the same financial condition they were just a few years ago. In 2017, want to be really clear about this. In 2017, they had $67 million in net assets. In 2020, that had over $1 billion in net liabilities. That's because of those dividends that they paid to themselves. We talked about in the first segment. But bottom line is 2020, $1 billion to the bad, 2017, $67 million to the good. So now what's the ability of the national company with that kind of a balance sheet, negative balance sheet, to support our Rhode Island hospitals? If they can't do that, then that means our Rhode Island hospitals are in trouble. That's why I needed security for their commitments.
Yeah, every business computes on a different platform and equation and formula what the net worth is. I'm sure very smart people listening to this think, well, Dan, obviously the answer to the question is the hospitals are worth zero because they lose money. That may not be the case. There are businesses that lose money but have what's called in the radio business, at least, a stick value, meaning and so it's very hard to figure out exactly what the net worth of a single institution would be, or whether you get it for scraps. But we know that they're not offering scraps. They're saving lives. They're curing people. It's an asset to the community. How you identify the value of the asset is a whole different ballgame. Real quick, you said, look, you got to plug in escrow under my jurisdiction, $80 million over the next 5 years, so that I think we need money in those hospitals, I draw on it.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, look, just to go back very briefly to the assets, the real estate's an asset. Another thing I was worried about is those hospitals, our hospitals, could be sold and leased back next summer to pay off another $100 million note. So there we're diminishing the asset even further. That was a real concern of mine. We had to get them off that note. So yeah, so what I wanted to make sure was that, look, they were prepared to commit to cover the operating losses and to make those capital expenditures. But I wasn't prepared to take those commitments alone based on what I knew about the financial condition of the national company. I wanted security. And so what we did was we calculated a couple things. What are the operating expenses going to be over the next 5 years? What are the necessary capital expenditures? And we backed out $7 million in fees that they've been charging them per year, and require them not to charge those fees anymore. So that value over 5 years is $35 million. Then we took $80 million and made them put it in escrow. What that means is they don't get that money back. That's now in our control, my control. The only way they're getting their $80 million back is if they make their commitments to cover the operating expenses and make the necessary capital investments. So if they keep their commitments, at the end of 5 years, over the course of 5 years, they'll get their money back. But if they don't, it's ours. If there's an insolvency event, the hospitals have that money at their disposal. Here's the other thing. Leonard Green put up over $30 million of that money. Okay, so Leonard Green, the partner that's going away, put in $30 million. And so we know that they're going to be there. The money's in escrow. Leonard Green did what they needed to do. The two new owners did what they needed to do. The hospitals today are more secure than they were 2 days ago. That money is in escrow now. They don't control it. I do. And if the hospitals need it, they're going to have it.
All right. So there you go. What does this mean for the business? Next. Attorney General Peter Neronha on the Fatima and Roger Williams Hospital deal that he has regulatorily enforced on the shift of ownership there. Details have already been discussed. What happens in 5 years, by the way, General, when your demand ends?
Yeah, look, our ability to regulate is really cabined by the Hospital Conversion Act for 5 years. Where we'll be in 5 years is at least we know those hospitals will still be there in 5 years. And they will have made that $72 million in capital expenditures that they've got to make. So the hospitals will be well maintained and well positioned. They're still going to own their assets, right? They're not going to be sold and leased back. That won't happen. So in 5 years, what we know is this: their operating balance sheet will be even. Okay, so they're going to be at worst even. We know there's going to be $72 million in capital investments, real capital investments, not smoke and mirrors, and they're still going to own their underlying assets, which we can't say for 15, 14 other hospitals around the country. So they're still going to be there, and we'll deal with 5 years in 5 years. But for the next 5 years, we're good.
I only have a couple of minutes to talk about, national health care, financing of hospitals. I mean, it's very easy conversation. But what does your gut tell you after this particular exercise, and also beginning to review what is going to be a huge merger between our two big hospitals in Lifespan and Care New England as they put their deal together? Give me 60 seconds. What does this mean to you? What's your perspective now?
Yeah, look, I think it reinforces, I think for all of us as regulators, Department of Health included, that we need to be really careful, skeptical. I don't mean unfairly skeptical, really careful when we're reviewing these transactions. You can't get rolled. You've got to make your own independent judgment, and you can't be afraid to stand up and push back where what you think is happening may all look rosy on the outside. And that was true in Prospect. We were being told everything's fine. You've got to be prepared to stand up if your conclusions are otherwise, and fight on behalf of the people of the state. Healthcare is too important not to take our role as a regulator seriously. That's our responsibility, and that's a responsibility we need to handle really well.
Yeah, I mean, the bigger picture on what America ought to do to finance its product or its right, or both, in terms of medical services, is a bigger question. But I'm guessing, although I don't see the transactions being anywhere near alike, that Lifespan in Care New England was watching. They were watching your engagement in this, so it reminds them that. Not that they needed to be reminded, I'm sure, because I'm sure they're operating in good faith, but there's going to be diligence, lots of it, correct?
Yeah, look, I mean, I've said from the beginning, and I'll say it again, if you want to come before this office and you want to talk about what it is you propose to do, and we have to approve it, don't hide the ball from me. Don't think you're going to throw a fastball by us. We've got a really strong healthcare team here now, and we're going to be looking at everything very carefully. All
right, General, thank you for your time. Most of the community has been really bullish on your oversight in this one, so appreciate the good work and the time. Final word and we come back, statements. So if the Attorney General doesn't step into this hospital deal, and a year from now, those two hospitals, Roger Williams and Fatima, fall apart, we come running to him saying, why didn't you step in? He stepped in. Looks like we got 5 years at least to breathe. You have a great night. See you on the radio, weekdays 3 to 6 on WPR. I'm back here next weekend on My State of Mind. See ya.